Welcome to our deep dive today into one of history's most chilling unsolved mysteries.
The
Um,
Dyatlov Pass incident.
the Dyatlov Pass incident, yeah. You've sent us so much, a collection of articles, research papers,
Hmm.
even your own notes on this case, and
It's fascinating
which
work.
really has captured everyone's attention. This event from 1959
Yeah.
in the Ural Mountains. 9 experienced hikers vanished,
Wow.
leaving behind a trail of clues that just don't add up.
They really don't. And I think that's what's so captivating about this case is that every piece of evidence that we seem to uncover just seems to lead to more questions than answers.
Right.
We have a tent ripped open from the inside, footprints leading away from shelter into the freezing night.
Hmm.
It's almost as if their survival instincts just completely went haywire.
Yeah. And the injuries, or the lack of external ones in some cases,
Right.
only add to the mystery. I mean, hypothermia
Of course.
in that brutal environment is understandable,
Sure.
but severe internal trauma with no visible signs of what caused it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where things get really interesting. And all the theories start to run wild.
Yeah, before we jump into the what ifs, maybe we should set the scene a little bit.
Okay.
So this wasn't a group of amateurs stumbling into the wilderness unprepared. These were seasoned hikers, mostly students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, and they were led by a very experienced hiker named Igor Dyatlov.
Okay.
They were on a challenging expedition aiming for, get this, grade 3rd certification.
Wait, grade 3rd certification. Now, I've seen that in the research, but what exactly did that entail back then?
So achieving grade 3rd certification required demonstrating expert-level skills in winter trekking, navigation, first aid, emergency survival.
Wow.
It meant that these hikers were highly trained, they were well-equipped for very challenging conditions, which makes their fate even more perplexing.
Wow, that really puts their experience into perspective.
Yeah.
So we have a group of highly skilled hikers led by Dyatlov setting out in the dead of winter in 1959. And if I remember correctly, this was during the height of the Cold War, which adds another layer of intrigue to this whole story, right?
Yeah, the political climate of the time, the secrecy surrounding Soviet military activities, it all casts a very long shadow over this incident. And some of the theories that we'll discuss later hinge on this Cold War context.
Okay, so we've got these skilled hikers, Cold War backdrop, and a challenging trek across the northern Urals planned.
Yep,
Their goal was to reach Mount Otorten.
that's right.
But something went terribly wrong. Can you kind of walk us through their journey and what led to their disappearance?
Certainly. So their initial trek went largely according to plan. They even cached supplies along the way, which is common practice for these types of expeditions to help them on their return trip. But then bad weather forced them to change course, diverting from their intended route towards a place called Kalatshak.
Koletchak, Dead Mountain. The name itself sounds ominous.
It does.
And it's become almost synonymous with this incident, hasn't it?
It really has. And this deviation from their planned route towards Kalatshakal was a crucial turning point in their journey. It set the stage for this whole mystery that unfolded.
And then silence. When they didn't return on schedule,
Yeah.
alarm bells started ringing. I imagine the families must have been frantic.
They were. And initially, there were some delays in the search efforts, which is not unusual in such remote and harsh environments. But as the days turned into weeks, the families pushed for a full-scale search and rescue operation.
So who was involved in the search? I know it eventually became a massive undertaking.
It did. So at first, it was fellow students and teachers from the Institute,
Okay.
driven by concern for their missing comrades.
Right.
But as days turned into weeks, the Army and police were brought in along with planes and helicopters to scour this vast, snow-covered landscape.
And then they found the campsite. It must have been a chilling discovery.
It was.
From the pictures that I've seen, the tent was damaged,
Really?
ripped open from the inside, as if they fled in a blind panic.
It was a deeply unsettling sight. Not only was the tent damaged, but they also found personal belongings, food, clothing, even shoes, scattered around the campsite. And then there were the footprints leading away from the tent into the darkness.
Footprints. But wouldn't they have been wearing proper winter boots and clothing?
You would think so, but that's the strange part. Some were barefoot, some were wearing only socks, others had just one shoe. It defied all logic, especially given the freezing temperatures. It was as if they had run for their lives. What were they running from? The footprints led the searchers about 1.5 kilometers from the tent to the edge of a forest near a large cedar tree. And that's where the first 2 bodies were found, Kvonashenko and Doroshenko.
The research mentioned they were found inadequately dressed. Is that right?
Tragically, yes. They were found shoeless and only in their underwear, huddled together near the cedar tree. The official cause of death was hypothermia. But even then, investigators were puzzled by their lack of clothing in such extreme conditions.
I can't even imagine the desperation that they must have felt.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking. And the other hikers, were they found nearby?
Not exactly. The searchers found signs that someone had climbed that cedar tree, breaking off branches as high as 5 meters. Perhaps they were desperately searching for something, maybe a glimpse of their campsite or a sign of rescue.
Glimmer of hope in a desperate situation.
Yeah,
What a haunting detail.
it is. And as the search continued, 3 more bodies were discovered further downhill. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin. They were found lying in the snow, and their positions suggested that they were attempting to make their way back to the tent.
So 5 bodies found, but still 4 missing.
That's right.
The mystery was only deepening.
Exactly. It took 2 long months before the remaining 4 bodies were discovered, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine deeper in the woods. And this is where the case takes an even darker turn.
2 months is a long time to wait for answers, especially for the families. I can't imagine the agony they must have endured. And when the remaining bodies were found, it only raised more questions. What did the investigators find?
Well, the discovery of those final 4 hikers,
Yeah.
Dubinina, Kolovatov, Thibaut Brignol, and Zolotaryov, added a whole new layer of complexity to the investigation. Unlike the first 5, who were found relatively close together
Right.
and seemingly attempting to return to the tent,
Yeah.
these 4 were deeper in the woods, buried in a ravine.
And their clothing situation was different too, wasn't it? Some sources I read mentioned they were better dressed than the first 5.
Yeah, you're right, some of them were.
Mm.
And there were signs that they had taken clothing from the deceased. For example, Dubinina was wearing Krivonashenko's trousers,
Okay.
which were torn and burned.
Mm.
It's possible that they were trying to share whatever clothing they had in a desperate attempt to stay warm.
Yeah, that makes sense. A last-ditch effort to survive in a dire situation. But the research also mentions some truly horrific injuries found on those last 4.
Right.
This wasn't just hypothermia anymore.
Absolutely. So Thibaut Brignol had massive skull damage, and both Dubinina and Zolotaryov suffered severe chest fractures. The force needed to inflict such injuries was described by some medical experts as comparable to a car crash.
A car crash. But they were miles from any roads. And there were no external wounds to match that level of internal trauma. How is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's as if the force that crushed their bones originated from within, not from any external blow.
Right?
And then there were those soft tissue injuries to the head and face,
Yeah.
found on those same 4 bodies.
Yeah. The missing eyes and tongue. It's a gruesome and unsettling detail. Was there any explanation for that?
Well, the forensic expert at the time believed that those injuries happened after death,
Okay.
likely due to the location of the bodies in running water, leading to decomposition and scavenging by animals.
Oh.
However, the mystery of what caused the initial fatal injuries remained.
Okay. So let's talk about the official investigation. They had the bodies, the scene, a whole lot of questions.
Right.
What did they conclude?
The investigation, which was led by a man named Lev Ivanov, began immediately. 6 deaths were attributed to hypothermia, while the other 3 were linked to those unexplained injuries.
Right.
But crucially, they ruled out foul play from the Mansi people,
Okay.
the indigenous reindeer herders in the region, or any other hikers.
So no signs of a struggle, no other footprints at the scene?
Exactly. There was no evidence to suggest that anyone else was involved.
Wow.
However, despite ruling out foul play, the investigative files were filled with details that only deepened the mystery.
Give us those key points. What were the most puzzling details from the official files?
For instance, the investigation determined that the hikers died 6 to 8 hours after their last meal. They apparently left the tent on foot, seemingly of their own accord. And perhaps most intriguingly, radiation was found on one victim's clothing.
Wait, radiation? What kind of radiation and why only on one person? That's a detail I haven't seen explored in much depth in the research you sent over.
Unfortunately, the files don't specify the type of radiation or which victim's clothing it was found on.
Oh, okay.
This lack of detail has only fueled speculation over the years.
That's right. And there's another intriguing detail that surfaced years later.
Oh.
Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator, admitted to seeing flying spheres in the sky around the time of the incident.
Flying spheres. Now we're venturing into X-Files territory. Was he suggesting UFOs were involved?
He didn't explicitly say that, but it's a detail that's captured the imagination of many. However, Ivanov also claimed that he was ordered to dismiss these sightings and not include them in the official report.
So a potential cover-up.
Uh,
That certainly adds to the intrigue, especially considering the Cold War context.
right.
But what was the official explanation for the deaths?
Despite all the strangeness, all the unanswered questions, the official conclusion was simply a compelling natural force.
Compelling natural force. That's incredibly vague, isn't it?
It
It
is.
feels like they were trying to close the case without really providing any satisfying answers.
It does. And
Yeah.
that's precisely why the Dyatlov Pass incident has remained such a captivating mystery for over 6 decades.
It's a case that refuses to be neatly explained, leaving us with more questions than answers.
So with the official investigation leaving us with a frustratingly vague conclusion,
Right.
let's dive into the various theories that have been put forward over the years. From natural disasters to military cover-ups, there's no shortage of ideas about what might have happened on that fateful night.
That's right.
Let's start with one of the most common explanations.
Okay.
An avalanche. It seems logical given the mountainous terrain and the heavy snowfall at the time.
It does seem logical. An avalanche would certainly explain the need for a hasty evacuation from the tent.
Right.
But would it account for those severe injuries?
That's where the avalanche theory starts to break down.
Yeah. If we look closely at the evidence, it doesn't quite fit.
Okay.
The searchers found no typical signs of an avalanche, no debris field, no significant snow buildup on the slope where the tent was located.
Yeah.
Plus, the tent itself wasn't flattened or buried as one would expect after an avalanche.
And you mentioned earlier that these hikers were highly experienced.
Wouldn't they have known better than to set up camp in an avalanche-prone area?
Precisely. Dyatlov and Zolotaryov in particular were seasoned winter hikers, familiar with the dangers of mountainous terrain. They would chosen their campsite very carefully, considering the potential risks.
Okay, so if an avalanche doesn't quite fit the evidence,
Right.
what about those katabatic winds I've read about?
Yeah.
Those are powerful downslope winds that can occur in mountainous regions, right?
Yes. Katabatic winds are powerful, cold gusts that can rush down mountainsides.
Wow.
Sometimes reaching hurricane-force speeds, they can be incredibly dangerous, especially in winter conditions.
So could a sudden katabatic wind have been the compelling natural force that drove the hikers from their tent?
It's certainly a possibility, and it's a theory that gained traction after a Swedish-Russian research expedition back in 2019.
Okay.
They proposed that a sudden, powerful katabatic wind could have hit the campsite, ripping open the tent and forcing the hikers to flee in terror. Yeah. I can see how that would create a sense of panic. Imagine being woken up in the middle of the night by this ferocious wind tearing at your shelter, the temperature plummeting.
Exactly. In such a scenario, their instinct to abandon the tent and seek shelter behind the tree line would make sense.
Great.
Remember that flashlight found on top of the tent? Perhaps they left it intentionally, hoping to use it to find their way back once the wind subsided.
That's a chilling thought, that glimmer of hope in the darkness.
It is.
But what about those severe injuries? Could a katabatic wind alone cause that kind of internal trauma?
Well, the 2019 expedition suggested that the group might have built temporary snow shelters near the tree line,
Okay.
and that one of these shelters collapsed, burying those 4 hikers found in the ravine.
Oh.
The weight of the snow could have caused the crushing injuries without leaving significant external marks.
That's a plausible explanation for the injuries,
Right.
but it still doesn't fully address that odd clothing situation.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
And that's one of the challenges with this case.
Yeah.
Finding a single explanation that accounts for all the strange and seemingly contradictory details.
Right. Well, in addition to katabatic winds,
Yeah.
I've also read about the potential role of infrasound. I've seen this mentioned in several of the articles you sent. But could you explain what it is and why it might be relevant to this case?
So infrasound is a very low-frequency sound wave,
Okay.
often below the range of human hearing.
Right.
It's generated by various natural phenomena,
Okay.
including wind.
Okay.
What's fascinating about infrasound is that even though we can't consciously hear it, it can have some strange effects on our bodies and minds.
Strange effects, like what?
Some research suggests that exposure to infrasound can induce feelings of unease,
Okay.
anxiety, even panic.
Mm.
It can also cause disorientation, hallucinations, and physical symptoms like nausea and dizziness.
Okay. Now that is interesting, and it seems relevant to this case. Is there any evidence to suggest that infrasound might have been present at Dyatlov Pass?
So Donnie Eicher, in his book Dead Mountain, argues that the specific terrain and wind patterns around Kholat Syakhl could have created what's called a vortex effect,
Okay.
generating powerful infrasound waves that night.
So, are we suggesting that these hikers were essentially driven mad by an invisible force? It sounds like something out of a horror movie.
It's a chilling possibility, but it's one that some researchers believe could explain the hikers' seemingly irrational behavior, fleeing their tent in a panic, inadequately dressed, and wandering into the freezing darkness.
But wouldn't the effects of infrasound wear off once they were away from the source? Wouldn't they have regained their senses and tried to return to the tent?
In theory, yes. But imagine being disoriented, terrified, the freezing cold just seeping into your bones.
Yeah.
They might have wandered for hours,
Wow.
lost and confused, unable to find their way back to the tent even if they wanted to.
So infrasound could explain the panic, the disorientation, even the paradoxical undressing.
Right.
But could it account for those severe injuries?
So Eicher theorizes that those 3 hikers who suffered the crushing injuries might have stumbled over the edge of the ravine in their panic state,
Okay.
the impact causing the trauma. However, even he admits that this is speculation.
Sure.
The exact effects of infrasound on human behavior are still not fully understood.
So we're left with a theory that explains the panic, but leaves those injuries somewhat ambiguous.
Right.
All right, let's move on from natural explanations to something a bit more, let's say, creative.
Okay.
We can't ignore those theories.
Yeah.
Especially considering your research included several articles about them.
That's right.
So let's talk about those military test theories. I've read a lot of speculation about secret weapons testing in the area. Is there any evidence to support those claims?
There are records of parachute mine testing in the region around the time of the incident.
Okay.
These mines were designed to detonate in the air, which some have suggested could explain the severe internal injuries without corresponding external wounds.
And what about those orange orbs some witnesses reported seeing in the sky? Were those ever connected to military activity?
It's possible. Those orbs could have been military aircraft or even the parachute mines themselves.
Okay.
The idea of these hikers unknowingly stumbling upon a secret military exercise, fleeing in terror, is certainly a compelling narrative.
It's like something out of a Cold War spy thriller.
Yeah.
But is there any concrete evidence to link those sightings to military activity?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
The investigators didn't mention those orange orbs in their 1959 report.
Oh.
And while some speculate about a cover-up, it's important to remember that information control was standard practice in the USSR at the time.
So, while it's tempting to imagine a Cold War conspiracy, we have to stick to the facts, or at least what we know of them.
Yeah.
But before we move on to other theories, let's talk about the paradoxical undressing phenomenon. It's something I haven't fully grasped from the research.
So it's a fascinating and somewhat counterintuitive phenomenon.
Okay.
So in cases of extreme hypothermia, as the body's core temperature drops, the blood vessels constrict to conserve heat. This can lead to a sensation of intense heat or burning, even though the person is actually freezing.
So they feel hot even though they're freezing.
Precisely. And this can lead to some irrational behavior, including removing clothing, even in sub-zero temperatures.
Wow.
It's a desperate, paradoxical attempt to cool down,
Okay.
driven by a misinterpretation of sensory signals from the body.
So some of the hikers found partially dressed, or even naked, could have been experiencing this paradoxical undressing.
It's certainly a possibility, and it could explain why some of them fled the tent inadequately clothed.
Right.
However, others seem to have acquired additional clothing from the deceased, which suggests they were still capable of somewhat rational thought and action.
It's another piece of the puzzle that doesn't quite fit neatly anywhere.
Yeah.
It seems like every answer we find only leads to more questions.
That's the nature of the Dyatlov Pass incident, I think. It's a case that defies easy explanations. It's a collection of clues that don't quite add up to a coherent picture.
So we've covered avalanches, katabatic winds, infrasound, military tests, even paradoxical undressing. Are we missing anything? Any other theories worth exploring before we try to piece this all together? We've explored some of the leading theories so far, but the research you sent also mentions some less conventional explanations. Like, what about animal attacks? Couldn't a bear or some other wild predator have been responsible for the hikers' deaths and the damage to the tent?
It's a question that comes up often, but when you really look at the evidence, animal attacks don't seem very likely. For one thing, the searchers didn't find any animal tracks near the tent or the bodies. And while a bear mauling could certainly explain some injuries, it wouldn't account for the severe internal trauma found on those 4 hikers, especially without any corresponding external wounds.
That's a good point. A bear attack would leave behind some pretty clear signs,
Definitely.
and those injuries just don't line up with a typical predator attack. Plus, these hikers were experienced in the wilderness. I mean, they knew how to deal with wildlife encounters.
Exactly. They would have taken precautions to avoid attracting animals to their campsite, and they were equipped to defend themselves if necessary.
Okay, so we can rule out bears and other predators. Were there any other less conventional theories put forward?
Well, some have pointed to the possibility of a group conflict,
Okay.
a fight among the hikers that escalated into violence, maybe a personal dispute, a romantic rivalry gone wrong, something that could have led to a physical altercation.
Yeah, I see where they're coming from, but wouldn't there have been signs of a struggle? Defensive wounds? Something to indicate a fight had taken place?
You would think so,
Yeah.
but the official investigation found no evidence of a fight. The hikers' belongings were scattered, not packed away as if they were preparing to leave in a hurry due to a disagreement. And again, those severe injuries, especially the internal trauma, don't really align with a typical fist fight.
So no bears, no brawls. Anything else we need to address before we move on? Oh, I do recall reading something about hallucinogenic mushrooms in one of the articles.
Ah, yes, that's another theory that pops up every now and then.
Yeah.
The idea that the hikers might have ingested hallucinogenic mushrooms, which are known to grow in the Urals.
Right.
And it's been suggested that this could explain their erratic behavior, their apparent panic, and their decision to flee the tent.
It's an interesting idea, but is there any evidence to support it? Did they find any mushrooms near the campsite? Or signs that the hikers had consumed them?
Unfortunately, there's no evidence to support the mushroom theory. The investigative files don't mention finding any mushrooms, and there's no indication that the hikers were experimenting with any substances.
Right.
And even if they had ingested hallucinogenic mushrooms, it's a big leap to explain everything that happened. The severe injuries, the missing clothing, the radiation on one victim's clothes.
Right. It seems like a stretch to attribute everything to a bad mushroom trip. So after examining all this evidence, considering all these theories,
Yeah.
what stands out to you? What seems the most plausible explanation for this tragedy?
Honestly, it's a tough question to answer definitively. There's no single theory that neatly accounts for all the strange and contradictory details of this case.
Yeah.
But for me, the katabatic winds,
Okay.
combined with the paradoxical undressing phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
seem to offer the most compelling explanation for their initial flight from the tent and their varied states of dress.
That makes sense. A sudden, violent wind tearing at their shelter in the middle of the night, the temperature plummeting.
Yeah.
Some of them already experiencing the disorienting effects of hypothermia. It would create a perfect storm of panic and confusion.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But even with the katabatic wind theory, those severe injuries, particularly the crushing internal trauma, remain difficult to explain.
Right.
Perhaps there was a secondary event, something we haven't considered,
Yeah.
that occurred after they fled the tent. Maybe a fall, a collapse of a snow shelter, something triggered by their desperate scramble for survival in the darkness.
Or maybe, just maybe, there's something else at play here. Something entirely unknown, a force or phenomenon we don't yet understand. The Dyatlov Pass incident reminds us that even in the face of human ingenuity and resilience, there are forces in this world that remain beyond our comprehension.
That's the beauty and the frustration of this case, isn't it?
It is.
It's a story that keeps us guessing, keeps us asking questions, keeps us searching for answers. It's a reminder that even with all our scientific advancements, there are still mysteries in this world that defy explanation.
And even after all these years, the mountains hold their secrets close. What do you think happened that fateful night on Dyatlov Pass? We've presented the facts, the theories, the possibilities. Now it's your turn to weigh the evidence, to form your own conclusions.
Maybe someday the full truth will come to light. Maybe a new piece of evidence will emerge, a witness will come forward, or a scientific breakthrough will shed light on what happened. But until then, the mystery continues to fascinate, and the Dyatlov Pass incident remains a chilling reminder of the enduring power of the unknown.